Julia, you spent years doing crypto investigations at Chainalysis before founding ZeroShadow. When you were responding to incidents and tracking stolen funds, what patterns did you repeatedly see that convinced you that the industry needed a different kind of security support?
Yeah, back at the early days with Chainalysis investigations, when we were seeing investigations come through and incidents come through, it was really these repeated attack vectors, especially on the smart contract audit kind of side, um, where the lessons that could have been learned from one incident weren't necessarily being observed and then remediated for other protocols that ended up in the same position. So that was one real early thing that I noticed, and the other was that the amount of monitoring of people's protocols that was happening was really limited. And so it might be days in between the time that an incident happens and the time that the team that is behind that protocol is actually realizing that their funds are gone and trying to engage any kind of support, or even just waiting for a Twitter post that says, "Hey, you might want to look at this," and that's how any responses start. And I think there's been a really strong evolution since that point as we look into the more recent years and especially the past 12 months. There has been a lot more emphasis put into monitoring protocols, really thinking about what kind of preventative measures or automated measures can be done to try to stop some kind of activity. And then we also see a lot more emphasis on having incident response plans and just thinking more about who are you going to reach out to when you do have some kind of problem that's happening. But I do think that the pattern that I still keep seeing, and maybe even more so, is this human element and this the person that is operating the keys or has some kind of entry point into the systems is actually the point of failure to have an exploit start. And there's a few different ways that we see that, but I think that's something that there's more attention being brought to it, but it's not really as matured as maybe some of this more on-chain elements have been.
And in terms of the maturing of the other pieces that you've spoken to that has kind of happened over the last few years, what do you attribute that to? Like, what is driving the increased awareness or increased kind of adoption of more mature security postures in the space from your perspective?
I think that really major hacks have made people start to pay more attention. So that has been one element. If you think about some of the really big North Korea hacks, you do tend to see that in the months that immediately follow, that other teams are looking more inwardly and trying to think about what they can do. And so, most recently with the Bybit hack, that there was so much more conversation around wallet management and simulating transactions and just even how much should be held in a single wallet and just all of those kind of more holistic security measures. But then the other, I think, big element is that there has been just an increase in security experts that we see within companies themselves. So they might have a really small team, but they're putting a more emphasis on having someone who is in charge of the security of their blockchain or their protocol, and maybe even bringing in someone who has some past experience from either traditional finance or more of a traditional cybersecurity lens. And so they have some more processes also to bring to the table and bring some experience to what might be a newer team. And so there's just a natural maturity there when you bring in the type of people who think that way, they just spread that education.
You've talked about the importance of incident war rooms and coordinated response. When a major exploit happens, what does the first 24 hours actually look like behind the scenes? And what are some of the biggest mistakes that teams make in that 24-hour window?
In the first 24 hours, there's a lot of coordinating that's happening. We see that teams are bringing in SEAL 911. Maybe they already have one or two investigative companies that they want to talk to. Potentially, they're trying to look at some of the more operational investigations that they could do. And in that first 24 hours, what we're really trying to focus on is keeping that team to as small of a group as it can be because you want to try to have more of a collaboration, but it's not necessarily everyone working at once. It's a little bit more coordinated. And then we're really thinking about three main aspects. So first, do we have triage of exactly what happened and can we mitigate against any further loss? So more of a preventative kind of aspect. Can we contain the situation that we have right now? Then thinking more about what is the on-chain element. So if we know any addresses, we're going to go right into trying to first signal that those are stolen addresses because we want to make sure that we can contain the laundering as much as possible. And time is really of the essence there. But then also trying to figure out exactly what happened, especially if it was a more technical incident where there might be a need to remediate some of the protocol before they could potentially unpause if they paused or something like that. And then with the communication side, that's something where a lot of teams will really want to either completely cover that anything happened or share a lot of information with their community to show that they're doing something. And that can be tricky. You need to kind of strike that balance because you want to make sure that you have enough to show that you are aware of the situation, but you don't want to reveal too much where it might compromise the investigation if there's um, any kind of leads that might need to be fully flushed out or even might be to the advantage of getting an end resolution with the attacker, like potentially something that could be used in negotiations. That's something where we try to give some consulting on that side as we're going within that initial stage. I think the two biggest mistakes that I see, I'll switch it to two, is one is that there's such a want to have a lot of information really quickly, but that's not always going to happen right away. And sometimes it takes some time to really pull at all these different threads that the attacker might have left and try to piece those together to have a better understanding of what's going on. And so patience ends up being important in these war rooms, especially to allow people to have that time to really collaborate and analyze together. And the second one that I would say is not thinking enough about law enforcement support. And a lot of teams, they're in a jurisdiction that allowed them to have maybe less regulations or less of a tax implication. Maybe they're really globally spread out and they're not really considering, well, who should I actually be reaching out to in this moment to try to get support? Because a lot of the recovery of funds, if funds are lost, does require or at least is a little bit less expensive if it has a law enforcement support. Although there is the chance to do some civil recoveries, and that can take a lot of time to get set up if a team hasn't thought about that in advance.
One thing I'd love to double click on there you mentioned was the kind of negotiations and obviously striking the balance of what information you share publicly if you're trying to keep your community in the loop, but with striking the balance with not sharing information that might help in negotiations. Just out of sheer curiosity, how much
Yeah.
are you involved in the actual kind of negotiation in the moment when that's something that ZeroShadow kind of actually takes on for your clients, like negotiating with attackers?
We'll give a lot of guidance just based on what we've previously seen. So, some of the language that might be a little bit more useful. How do you want to communicate with the attacker? What kind of deadlines do you want to set? What kind of follow-up should you do? And often we do say that having a follow-up would really depend on having some more information to kind of use in your benefit and bring them to the table. So every team wants to take their own approach to that, and I think it's a good thing that it's not just us directing, but it's a little bit more of a cooperation. But I think generally we tend to say that being a little bit less confronting to the negotiator and trying to have more of a conversation does tend to have better results. And so we're just trying to craft it in that way.
Interesting.
Yeah.
From the investigations that you've been involved in, how have attackers evolved over the past few years, whether that's more sophisticated technical exploits or organized cybercrime groups, or targeted social engineering against crypto teams? Like what has the evolution been?
I would say we see a lot more of a organized group that is operating rather than necessarily just individuals who come across the opportunity to perform some kind of exploit. Um, a couple just that come to mind, the Dangerous Password group within North Korea has been a really big group on the rise in the past few years. This is the group that you've probably heard, which is the fake Zoom links that can lead to malware, and the amount of damage that they can do is just ever climbing. And one of the big aspects of that is that once they've compromised someone, they can use their credentials to try to get new people as victims. And so we see a lot of this just more organized activity, and that's on the laundering side too. So that means that funds can move in a much more automated way, a lot more 24/7 movement, just having a lot more of a sophistication to it that leaves less opportunities for recovery, or at least the windows to ever have that recovery are very small. So that those are two main aspects that I've seen. We do definitely still see especially on the smart contract exploit side, more of what you would consider an individual who found some kind of opportunity. I know there's a lot of buzz right now about vibe coding and exploit and how that might be a future risk that people face. But I don't think that the risk surface there is nearly as large as more of this organized activity.
Um, Thinking about your particular experience, sitting at this interesting point in the kind of security life cycle, which is basically like the moment things go wrong. And then you get to see all of the different paths that lead people to this place that things did go wrong. And then you obviously like help mitigate the losses, help put fixes in place, all that kind of stuff. If you were then a protocol, a TradFi company, whatever, who is deploying on chain for the first time, and you were tasked with setting up the sort of most ideal security process kind of from start to finish, how would you, with all the experience you have on the kind of reactive side, I guess, what would you do on the proactive side to be best equipped with the, I don't know, the reality of security as you see it today?
I think there's two main things that I would really focus on. So one is having a really well-developed operational security stack. We see a lot more consideration for governance, risk, and compliance, and things like getting a SOC 2 certification or something like that. But I think that it can be really tailored into a very Web3 specific way, and having so much as logs in place for different types of softwares and also and environments, and also just having this like law of least privilege for access points. I think that goes a long way. And then if there is any exploit that does happen, you have a lot more information about what the potential attack surface is. And I think knowing exactly what happened is really important because it means that you can mitigate against it and try to make sure that that doesn't happen again versus having such a wide breadth of potential vectors that you're kind of just left with this focus on the recovery side. So that would be one part. And then I think the second part would be doing a lot of work on the monitoring side to have automations in place. So not just knowing the moment that anything is looking suspicious, but having the mechanisms in place to be able to hit the pause button and evaluate it and then be able um, to move forward. And you do want to strike that chord. You don't want to be starting and stopping all the time and having lots of problems, and maybe that is not good for your users. But I think that we've seen so many instances where having that ability to do an automated response saves millions and millions of dollars, and so that can have a really big impact.
And last question, which is the final course, your security hot take. What do you have for us? What's your provocative perspective that you can share with everybody?
I think my provocative perspective is something that I also talked about in the Dev Connect and DeFi Security Summit conferences, which is that I think that a lot of decentralized protocols need to consider what they can do to prevent money laundering from happening. There's so much activity we see that goes through protocols that are not actually as decentralized as they might want to outwardly appear, and they do have some ways that they could at least try to disrupt some of this laundering and make it so that um, the there's less incentive for the launderers to keep using their products. And when you see a certain bridge say that their numbers have 90x this month, that is probably because North Korea went through their bridge. And so it's not necessarily that you're having this really strong usage from a great community. It's really a profit from other people's lost money. And I think that there's been a lot that I've seen towards this of people coming kind of towards this idea and doing a lot about it. And I think when the threat intel product that we're doing is going to at least help to show which addresses are illicit addresses in a faster way, but then it's about what does the protocol who receives that information decide to do with that information. So there are lots of cool ideas that we have for how to actually approach this that are not just KYC for everyone. So it's worth a conversation, but it's not the core ethos of what DeFi is meant to be.